Hello and welcome from the Old Stone House Museum in Brownington, Vermont for today's video on how to build a backyard compost pile. My name is Shannon. I work with the Northeast Kingdom Waste Management District here in beautiful northeastern Vermont. And I'm excited to show you how building a backyard compost with food scraps from your kitchen is a great way to save money on trash disposal while reducing your greenhouse gas emissions, since you'll be removing methane-generating food scraps from your trash and instead using that resource to make a nutrient-rich soil amendment for your lawn or garden. In Vermont and in the rest of the U.S., up to 25% of the average household's trash is food waste and other organic material that can be composted. So many of us have all the ingredients we need to compost right in our own homes. When you are ready to start composting, it can be exciting and a little bit intimidating when you see all the information there is out there about compost recipes, bin designs, maintaining the compost pile, and more. The goal of this video is to provide you with the information you need to feel confident experimenting with a backyard compost. So let's begin.
Before starting our compost pile, we first need to choose a good location in the backyard. Choose a location with well-drained soil that is convenient and accessible any time of the year. Wherever you choose to have your compost, it is recommended to take some animal proofing measures, such as containing your compost in a bin and reinforcing that bin with hardware cloth, which can be purchased at many hardware stores. As for bin designs, there are many options you can choose from. You can build your own using pallets or chicken wire, or you can purchase a bin at many hardware stores and solid waste districts in Vermont. Whatever design you choose, make sure it allows air and moisture to flow throughout the pile. I do not have any hardware cloth today, so after prepping the compost location by removing any grass, sod, sticks, or twigs, I'm ready to build my compost. To begin, I am building the first layer of the compost using yard waste, including dried leaves, mulch hay, and small sticks. This initial layer is important as it will promote airflow and balance moisture as the pile breaks down. I want my initial layer to be about 10 to 12 inches tall. Never start a compost pile by placing food scraps directly on the ground. This would be an invitation for burrowing animals to come and have a tasty meal.
With my bottom layer ready, I can now begin adding food scraps to my compost pile. So let's take a minute and talk about composting ingredients. You may have heard that compost works best with the ideal carbon-nitrogen ratio of 30:1. If you're like me, hearing about a 30:1 carbon-nitrogen ratio sounds a little bit confusing. How would I know if the ingredients I have will help me to achieve that ratio? You may have also heard about compost recipes using browns and greens to build a compost pile. Let's talk about how the browns and the greens relate to the 30:1 carbon-nitrogen ratio. Composting browns refers to ingredients that are a source of carbon for our compost pile. They typically are dry and woody and therefore promote moisture and airflow throughout the compost pile. These ingredients include things like dried leaves, mulch hay, sawdust, wood chips and shavings, and shredded paper. Composting greens refer to ingredients that are a source of nitrogen. Greens are typically wet and heavy ingredients that include food scraps like fruit and veggie peels, eggshells, coffee grounds, bread and pastas, as well as fresh manures. There are things you want to avoid putting into your compost, including meat, bones, and dairy. While these materials do decompose, they take a very large compost pile to break down fast and effectively. In your backyard compost, they would produce odors that would attract animal visitors. Now let's get back to the importance of the carbon and nitrogen ratio. Carbon and nitrogen are very important in our compost pile as they help to support healthy and active microbial populations. It's the bacteria and the fungus in our compost pile that do the hard work of decomposition. So basically, I like to think that when we build a compost pile, we're trying to build the perfect environment for our composting microorganisms to break down our food scraps as quickly as possible. While we may not know the carbon or nitrogen content of any of our composting ingredients, we know we can achieve the 30:1 carbon-nitrogen ratio by building our compost pile with roughly 3 times the amount of browns than greens. So, for every gallon of food scraps we add to our compost, we'll want to add roughly 3 gallons of wood chips, leaves, hay, or other browns. This 1-to-3 ratio will not only help to support healthy microbes in our compost, but will also promote optimal moisture and airflow as material breaks down. Now that we've reviewed composting ingredients and recipe and the importance of carbon and nitrogen to our composting microorganisms, we're ready to build our compost pile.
Since we have our bottom layer of compost ready, we can now add our first layer of green food scraps. Any layer of food scraps should be no more than 6 inches tall. Next, we want to add roughly 3 times as much browns material to completely cover the food scraps so they are no longer visible. Covering the food scraps completely will ensure minimal odors and animal visitors. Continue building your layers, making sure to stick to the 1-to-3 volume ratio of greens and browns. By layering your pile with this ratio, you're ensuring that the composting microorganisms have access to all the nutrients they need while promoting proper moisture and airflow throughout the pile. While not a necessary ingredient, I was given the gift of fresh manure from 2 friendly horses, so I'm going to add the manure to the pile before my final brown layer. Animal manures are great for jump-starting your compost pile and can help mitigate odors. After my final brown layer, I am adding a few gallons of water to my pile to ensure there is enough moisture to support the composting microbes. As your compost breaks down, food scraps will release moisture, so if you live in a wet climate like Vermont, you will not need to add water to your compost often, but you'll want to add it to a new pile.
Every time I add material to my compost, I'll make sure to stick to the 1-to-3 greens to browns volume ratio. Notice how, to start, I built a medium-sized compost. I did this because it's the center of the compost pile where microorganisms are most active. If our compost pile is too small, there will not be enough material to support active microbial populations. With this medium-sized compost, as microorganisms become active in the center of the pile, they will generate heat, which will speed up decomposition. The larger the compost, the more heat it will generate, and the faster materials will break down. In about 1 month, I'll want to check on my pile to see if it's breaking down, and to turn my pile to promote airflow and move any food scraps on the outer edge of the pile into the center. If you feel heat coming from your pile, you know it is active and working. Now, if you do not feel heat coming from your pile, or it's causing odors, you know that something is not working optimally with your compost. Odors are a telltale sign that your compost recipe needs to be adjusted. Check to see, is your compost pile too wet? Optimal moisture levels in a compost pile are about 50 to 60%, like a wrung-out sponge. If it is too wet, fresh air and oxygen cannot flow through the pile to the microorganisms. Anaerobic, oxygen-loving bacteria will quickly die and be replaced with stinky anaerobic bacteria. If it is too wet, turn the pile to reintroduce oxygen and add more brown materials to get the desired moisture level. Likewise, if your compost pile is too dry, the microorganisms will dry out and die. So, if your compost does not appear active and is dry, simply adding water will reinvigorate the microbial populations. If you're experiencing issues with your compost, take a good look at your compost recipe and experiment with adjusting the ingredients while sticking to the 1-to-3 greens to browns volume ratio. Now, you may be wondering how long it will take to turn your food scraps into a usable compost. Typically, if you start your compost in the spring and add materials throughout the summer, by the fall, you will have a finished compost. Even though this compost looks finished, there are still nutrients being processed by the microorganisms. So we can remove this finished compost from the pile and allow it to cure in another bin or under a tarp for a few months. Then, in the spring, it will be ready to add to your lawn or garden. Today, we covered a lot of things, so to recap, we discussed how typically everyone creates food waste, and backyard composting is a great way to keep food waste out of the trash and to make a nutrient-rich soil amendment. We learned that regardless of what bin design you choose or where you choose to build your compost, you want to consider how to promote optimal moisture and airflow throughout your compost pile and how to keep away animals. We talked a lot about composting ingredients and the importance of carbon and nitrogen for our composting microorganisms. These microorganisms do the work of decomposition, so we want to do whatever we can to promote healthy and active microbial populations in our compost. Our composting microbes are most active when they get the ideal amounts of carbon, nitrogen, air, and water. If your compost pile is not breaking down or is causing an odor, take a look at your composting ingredients and adjust your recipe to get the desired outcome. I hope you enjoyed today's video on how to build a backyard compost. Now get outside and experiment with one of your own.